Hello, and welcome to video number 10, I believe, on population ecology. This is a pretty close relation to chapter 5. We've kind of covered the different types of interactions between different organisms and the different roles. So this is strictly going to be kind of focused on population ecology. Remember, the definition of population is all the organisms of the same kind living in one area. So this would be a population of caribou here. Either that or reindeer, I'm not sure. Population growth, we've got three types, and we have talked about these already, but just as a reminder, the first one is exponential growth, which is shown by the red line. Population growth that is exponential can be shown by the rate times the number of individuals over this change in time. And so you get this very sharp J curve is what we've called it before. And that is exponential growth. And there we go. And then another type is logistic growth, which is not the J curve. It's going to look very similar to start with, and then over time it evens out at K. And in this case, K is the carrying capacity. And we're going to talk about what carrying capacity is, but know that a logistic curve is one that hits the carrying capacity. This would be great if I had a pen. And then the last type is linear. Linear growth is pretty rare in nature, but it is one to be aware of. Linear growth is just a straight line without any kind of bends to it. So those are the three possible types of population growth. Typically, you're going to see exponential initially and then tails off as a logistic growth curve. Carrying capacity is going to be something that kind of limits our further growth, but we'll get into that. Populations can grow, shrink, or remain stable. So these are what's called age structure diagrams, these kind of graphs down here. There's something we're going to do a lot in the next section with human population, but it's worth introducing them right now. So the way that population can grow would be by new births or by immigration, things entering into the population. If we're talking about that caribou herd from the very first slide, that might be caribou from a nearby herd that immigrate into or join up with the one in question. They would shrink then by deaths, so natural deaths as things die, they're no longer in the population, or emigration, so that would be the other herd that lost a few individuals to the first herd. One thing that's important to note with these age structure diagrams is they give us a bunch of information kind of on the future of this population. We've got rapid growth on the left here, and that's shown by a really large number of individuals in the blue. And if you look at the blue, this is ages 0 to 14. These diagrams here are for humans, and so that blue is pre-reproductive individuals. And so if you have a lot of individuals that have not reached reproductive maturity or sexual maturity yet, you can guess that you're going to have a lot of births in the future as those large number of individuals become mature and start reproducing. In a zero growth population, you can see how narrow that pre-reproductive stage is. The middle stage would just be the reproductive stage for humans, that's 15 to 44, and then the pink stage is the post, and that would be ones that have not died but are past reproducing. So they're still part of the population, but they don't really affect how much it's going to grow in the future. They may contribute to its shrink if and when they do pass away, but they're not reproducing in that last stage. So that's how they can change. Controls. So there are a lot of controls on population growth. This is kind of a very classic model for this theory, and this is the barrel theory for population growth, or the barrel model would probably be a better way to phrase it. There is some sort of limiting factor, and this limiting factor is really important for our purposes. All right, there's always some sort of limiting factor when you're talking about the size of a population. And so each of these slats of the barrel represent a factor for this population, right, or this organism. And how much water in the barrel, right, water in the barrel is equal to the population, right, population. And so you can see some of the things this organism needs to live. We're probably talking about a plant here, right? Because it needs light, something that photosynthesizes. It needs heat, right? Plants can't grow in the tundra, or most plants can't grow up in the tundra. So this plant needs some sort of heat. some sort of mechanical support. Maybe it needs to grow on trees like an air plant. It needs some sort of organic matter, right? It's got to get some nutrients somehow. Phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium, other nutrients would all fit with that. And then water and air. So this definitely seems like some sort of plant in the environment that it's growing in, that this population lives in. That environment or that ecosystem has a set amount of this stuff, right? There's a certain amount of heat at the environment, depending on where it is located on the globe. There's a certain amount of mechanical growth. We have a very high amount of mechanical support. So this population we're dealing with is probably one that's located in the forest, right? A lot of trees or buildings or large structures that can grow on. As you go through this, you'll see that one of these slats is the lowest, right? The lowest here is the phosphorus, and so phosphorus is our limiting factor. This is what determines how big the population can be. The population cannot grow. We can't add any more water into our bucket or into our barrel unless the amount of phosphorus available in this ecosystem were to increase. Now, these limiting factors can change with time, right? If this is a rainforest plant that grows on the branches of other trees like an air plant, and let's say that rainforest goes through a severe drought, the water factor could drop well below the nitrogen. And if that were the case, that would now be the limiting factor. If that happens, the water level drops, meaning the population would have to drop as well. So these are some controls. We talk about controls being either density dependent or density independent. A density dependent control would be things that keep a population from growing bigger based on how many individuals are in the area. So this might be something like the resources, food. The more individuals you have, the more food, resources. I think I spelled that wrong. That's pretty good. Resources, how much food there is. If you have a lot of individuals eating a lot of food, then you could run out of food for more of them. It could be something like disease. If you have a lot of organisms living together, it makes disease easier to transmit between them, and so that could reduce the population, right? That would be kind of a health, which is not one of the factors on this barrel. But disease is another one that's density dependent. It could be predators, right? If you have a lot of prey living together, it's going to attract some predators, and those predators would control the population and reduce it down. Something that's density independent would be something like the weather, right? That plant that we shifted it from the rainforest to the desert, that is density independent. That change is going to happen no matter how many plants you have there. If it happens, and it will bring it down. So weather's a really good one. It could be anything that doesn't depend on how many individuals are in that area. So that's some controls on population growth. We get a graph kind of like this, and so this is our standard population growth. So this would be kind of a new species being introduced to this environment. Starts with very low population size. As time goes on, we see that area of exponential growth where it shoots up really, really rapidly until it reaches the carrying capacity. And so carrying capacity here, which is always denoted as the capital K, is what that limiting factor allows the population to be. And so we've got this force, this biotic potential, pushing the population along until that biotic potential meets some environmental resistance, which stabilizes it out. And you're always going to get this kind of oscillation around the carrying capacity. When it's over top, we call that overshoot, and we would say the population has overshot or is in a state of overshoot, and that means that it is exceeding the carrying capacity. So we expect a crash to follow that, and you can see here it does crash back down, and then there's some excess resources there, so it'll rise back up and so on and so forth. Over on the right here are a couple different biotic potentials and environmental resistance things, very similar to some of the things I talked about in the last one. I'm not going to read them all. So overshoot, this is another graph showing the overshoot. I'm not sure why I put in two separate ones here, but again, you can see it overshoot up over the carrying capacity and then drop back down, and overshoot and drop back down. So it kind of oscillates there. It's usually not going to follow this blue line, which is kind of the ideal theoretical one. You typically have some variations in nature. Realistically, what can happen is after a period of overshoot, whatever that limiting factor was that set the carrying capacity, if you are in a state of overshoot, typically that factor gets depleted. So we're thinking about that air plant that we had with the barrel model. If it really needs that phosphorus, and that's the limiting factor, if the population were to overshoot, it's going to draw an excess amount of phosphorus out of the environment, more than what can be naturally recycled. And so it might drop the actual reserve of phosphorus in that ecosystem down, which would lower the carrying capacity. And so you get this really abrupt, sharp crash because you've degraded the carrying capacity. That's a big fear with the human population right now, is we're not sure if we're in overshoot, if we have the resources to sustain us. We kind of are artificially sustained by technology and how globally connected we are, how we can bring resources from one ecosystem to the next. Survivorship curves are something we definitely want to talk about and be familiar with. There are 3 types. What you are showing here is we are starting out with 100 organisms of all 3 of these different types of animals: frogs, birds, and humans. And over time, we're looking at how many of them are still surviving. And so for a type 1 organism, it's something that has a very long life. And right, as time goes on, we're losing very, very few of these organisms, right? We've got a very strong survivorship. And then once we reach old age, right, 70, 80, 90 years old, we really start to see a lot of those 100 individuals die. So we're kind of looking at the average number of, like an average sample, 100 average people. Some of them will die early, and so you get a very small amount, but most of them live pretty late into life before they pass away. And an organism that's type 2 kind of splits the middle here. You don't really have one way or another, but you end up the same result. So we have the 100 individuals. It's kind of a nice, slow, steady decline. Something like a frog, right? Frogs lay an awful lot of eggs, and their strategy is very different than humans. Rather than caring for 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, depending on your family size, offspring, and really making sure they succeed, like what humans do, frog's going to lay a whole mess of eggs in a pond or in a puddle or in a lake or somewhere in the water, and they kind of just abandon it. And their strategy is, if I lay enough eggs, they're not all going to survive, but the strongest ones will survive, and they will reproduce. And so it's a very different strategy. So out of 100 average frogs, you lose a lot of them right off the bat, right? Maybe a fish ate the eggs, or maybe a bird ate the eggs, or maybe the eggs dried up. So whatever the reason, maybe the pH got too high in the water they were laid in and they didn't hatch. For whatever reason, a lot of these frogs die early, and you have very few of them make it to later in life. Both of these strategies are effective depending on the species. It's just a very different type of strategy. And so we call these R and K selected species. The frog would be our R selected species, and the K would be the humans. And so let's talk about the R species first. Typically, the R species can be very small, like insects, mammals, very small mammals. Bacteria is a very strong R selected species. Weeds, like weeds in your yard, like dandelions, would be R selected. They don't use a lot of energy to reproduce with, and they make up a whole bunch of offspring, right? So we're going to make a whole lot of them. They're not all going to live, but the ones that do live are going to make a whole lot of them too, and so we'll survive this way. And so they don't live very long, and they usually have very few reproductive events in their life. So type 3 is the R selected on the survivorship curve. K selected is the exact opposite. These are very big animals, elephants, gorillas, things like that, that put a lot of time and energy. Right? We spend a lot of time caring for our young. You're probably still under your parents' care if you're watching this video, and they've invested a lot of energy in your survival, which is probably partially why you're still here today. Unfortunately, they don't make a lot of offspring, so there's not a lot of individuals being made because they're so costly to have, and that long life expectancy allows more than one reproductive event in their life. And so that's type 1 usually. Type 2 is kind of in between, but typically they're going to be more K than R. Some examples of them, we've got our R-selected species, dandelions I mentioned. This is the bacteria. It's like a little groundhog or something like that. Insects are good R-selected species, and these are algae over here. Some K species then, we've got the elephants, the gorillas, hippos, killer whales or orcas, and then people, of course, are great K selected species. Things that have very large offspring and they care for them. They spend time looking after them. That's the end of the video. So please come tomorrow with some evidence that you watched the video, and that could be in the form of notes or questions, things like that. I look forward to the discussion tomorrow. Thank you very much.